Is that working? Yeah, okay. Thank you for, first of all, for having us here. And as you might have seen, the subject is technology and terminology, although the main motto of the staff is words matter. So it seems that we should be only talking about terminology. So I'm even more happy that you are all here. And of course, hello to all the online participants that I can see, but you can see us. So in this panel, we will focus on a few more current and I think more forward-looking things than the past, although the past is there. So you are free to ask your questions on the Slido as we discuss. And if these questions come up relevant to the topic or they are very pertinent, we'll take them as we go. Because remember, this is not a rehearsed performance for you to watch. This is for you. So all of us, we have come here to discuss things with you, to exchange views, to see what we think, whether we think we are going to the right direction. So to start us off, I will say a few words about each of the panel participants. So Barbara Heinisch, she's a researcher and a lecturer at the Center for Translation Studies at the University of Vienna. When I was going through the bios, because you can read the full bios on the TEF site, I was playing a little game and trying to fish out a technology element in each of the bios, and I managed. So the terminology and technology is part of all of us. In Barbara's case, she was researching translation, terminology, but the juicy bit is I found research about LLMs and how they could be used in terminology work. So this is really interesting. We have among us also Nina Elama. She comes to us from the Prime Minister's office in Finland, so a different setup. And she works as terminologist in the Translation and Language Division of the Prime Minister's office. And I think that this is going to be really interesting to have a different point of view and a very recent experience in, well, I can't say now what. Okay, time will come and you will know. I will certainly give that opportunity. Simon Varga, a lecturer and a researcher at the Faculty of Translation Studies, Linguistics and Cultural Studies, University of Mainz. And apart from teaching translation, technology, and terminology, he has vast experience in processes and language technology and processes, which I find fascinating. And Greg, our own Greg, DGT Greg Janakis. So he's an English language terminologist and translator in the English language department. And he recently graduated from Translation and Technology Studies at the University of Geneva. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Finally, myself. I got a note on myself as well, just not to forget. So I won't be long. I joined the Commission's DG Translation to be the IT project manager of Euramis. I don't know if you know about it, but that's something we could take on for the next step. And since 2020, I've been heading the Terminology Coordination Unit, which last month was renamed into Data Management Unit. So now it's Data Management Unit. The unit is bigger, but we do have a sector of terminology coordination. So maybe it's a sign of times that we go that way. That I leave you to comment. So okay, let's go to my first question. Every translator is, in fact, a terminologist. Do we need to train terminologists or not, maybe? Maybe it's just enough.
Hello. I would say that every translator, including literary translators, but also, of course, interpreters, are somehow terminologists. Many of them, unfortunately, reluctantly, they do terminology work because they have to do it. But of course, terminology is very important in every text that we as translators and interpreters produce or work on. So the question to you would be, who of you considers yourself as a passionate terminologist? Oh, great. So about 20 people, I would count. So the other ones who do terminology because they have to do it, it's rather a tedious work and it's annoying. Don't hesitantly, but still some people. In my courses, unfortunately, it's the other way around. So I teach terminology courses and the students reluctantly do terminology work. But terminology work is, of course, very important. And you asked the question, why should we still teach terminology, especially to translators? On the one hand, we've heard about it throughout the conference already, that terminologists or translators have competences that are useful in many other areas of work and professions as well. And among these are, of course, the traditional language competence, but also the domain competence, and what is very important, collaboration, negotiation with domain experts, with translators to find basically, for example, equivalent terms in the target language, for example. And also this investigative drive to find a solution, to find a good definition, to find an equivalent in the target language. So these detective skills in really diving into a terminological issue are, of course, competences that are very important. On the one hand, of course, in translation, but of course, in any type of work that requires an in-depth investigation of a certain topic.
Greg, maybe you from the inside?
Yeah, so I graduated from the University of Geneva 3 years ago, and I did a degree in where a specialization in terminology was possible. So in my 2-year program, I had 4 classes devoted to terminology. Terminology just theory, terminology practice, terminology technology, and corpus management. And yeah, I felt like those classes really prepared me for my professional life. I had 2 internships after I graduated, and I really felt like I had been prepared. I mean, I had to learn the specificities of each organization and their terminology management system. But yeah, in my program, we really got practical experience. I mean, one project that we had to do was we were given like a relatively new word in English, or a word that hadn't been kind of translated or documented too much in other languages, and we had to propose candidate terms, use terminology theory to justify the ranking of the candidate terms. We had another project that we had to do where we were paired up with an expert in an international organization or a private company. I was paired with the WIPO, World Intellectual Property Organization, and we made 20 kind of mock entries for them. And we had like a limited amount of contact with the expert, so we had to know how to structure our arguments. Yeah, so I really got practical experience, and I think often, now that I'm working as a terminologist, and I've already had a few trainees that I've trained or mentored myself, I find that when they talk about their terminology studies, it's only like, you know, we learn how to use multi-term, we learn how to add a term base to Studio, whereas I think there is some value in kind of keeping terminology somewhat separate from translation, so that it's kind of valued more, and that the theory behind it is kind of taught. Yeah.
So maybe a dive into the past I will share with you, because I actually, when I think about it, I wrote my master thesis on terminology, but that was so long ago. So just to tell you that at my time, there were 4 computers at the university, and we had to enroll to get access to one of them, because the 3 others were accessible only to academics, so to professors. So actually at the faculty, we had only one. So that was the beginning of terminology work, and I remember there were, I had to learn myself how to use MS Access. That was the only thing that was there, and how to do those fiches and to be able to filter out. When I got the first, I had a collection of 30 cosmetic terms or something. I don't remember. I might be making this up. And then the first time I could filter something out, and it didn't break, and it was such a joy. It was an IT joy, though, because I had to struggle with MS Access and not that much with theory of terminology. But I think that I envy you, all those young people, and you're mostly young here, that you have these possibilities now, and that you can really like focus on the stuff you like, or you are made to do during your studies. Yeah, so if that's so easy, if the translators can, people say that, yeah, I mean, terminology work, right, closer, right, okay. Terminology work is not that complicated, and some people do that aside, as Greg says, and we can do it ourselves on the side track. If that's so easy and it can be like seamlessly integrated in the workflow, what do you think? Is it a correct statement, or it's a delusion? I mean, that people who say that, they don't grasp how complex terminology work is, or they are right, and we are just overdoing it because we want to be visible. Us, you know, the last mammoths of terminology left somewhere. My question would be to Nina. You have experience recently with a very interesting project, and I would like you to share with us that.
Thank you. First, I'd like to tell about my background. I come from an organization where we have 70 to 75 translators and 3 terminologists and some language technology experts. So we are a big group, and that's because we have 2 national languages in Finland. In our organization, we first of all serve all government ministries, so we have a wide area, many topics, and always something interesting going on, also for terminology work. Yeah, how can or should translators be involved in terminology work, in like you said, full-fledged terminology work, and is that what they should do, or can they do, or so? Well, if we talk about full-fledged terminology work, it contains so much more than a translator can do, and of course translators have to focus on producing text and doing the translations, of course when we talk about terminology work, what it contains, it's like concept analysis, writing definitions, finding out what the relationships between terms are, what term candidates in various languages might be, and you know, all of that. So of course translators can't do or shouldn't do all of that, but it's a different job to do all that, but I must say that it's so fruitful when terminologists and translators work together, and that's what we do in some projects, or many projects, as ministries, for example, want to do a glossary on a topic, like we worked on, for example, glossary of immigrant integration or glossary on continuous learning or something like that. And when there are people in our organization who know about those things and those terms, it's so wonderful to have all the conversations and decide the terms and what notes and other information should be there. So yeah, not full-fledged terminology work for translators, but I'm happy that they many are involved and want to be involved.
I mean, I think when we ask the question, do we still need terminologists? As always, when we ask such a question, we need to ask what for. Traditionally, everybody hated terminology. If we look at it from, let's say, a company perspective, terminology costs money. Terminology requires resources from my subject matter experts, but I pay them a lot of money to do subject matter stuff, not terminology. So let's say terminology was not really popular, and we only really talked about terminology and why it's important, typically in the context of either technical writing or translation. I think what you said earlier, that your department has been renamed, gives us a good indication of what terminology actually is. Because when we're talking about terminology, we're talking about language data. And there are a lot of ways to put it. Data is the new oil, and so on and so forth. But
For our online audience.
it's okay? Like this? Okay, sorry. I'll stop fidgeting. Where was I? When we look at what we traditionally did with terminology, it was rather limited. But today, we can do a lot more. We heard about neural machine translation, in this case e-translation, not being so great out of the box, terminology-wise speaking. Today, we're at a point where we can use terminology to customize MT output on the fly. When NMT was first released, we did model training, we did model customization. It cost a lot of money, it cost a lot of time. We had to evaluate it, and maybe the results weren't so great, and we had to throw the model away. Today, we just add terminology, and the model adapts the translation on the fly. We can do that in many CAT tools. We have Balash here from MOQ, who just released such a feature. And with LLMs, this trend is becoming more pronounced. We heard earlier about variables in prompts. Yeah, there's a variable. Please translate this text and use these terms. Please translate this text and use these translation memory matches. So I think terminology is becoming more important. The thing is, when we talk about terminology in the context of translation and in the context of this question, I'm with Nina. Those are two different things. From my experience as a translation student, as a translation teacher, as a translation professional, usually, or in many cases, we speak about actual terminology work. Okay, what should we call this? What should we call that? But there is a whole other side to terminology, and if we want to speak about terminology as data, this other side is increasingly important, namely terminology management, data management. If I have so many possibilities to use this wonderful data, well, maybe I should have the workflows in place to get this data where needed without having to download, reconvert, re-upload it every single time something changes. And that's something completely different. And from my opinion as a teacher and as a student, that's something that we're typically overlooking in academia. We learn a lot about the linguistic side of things. How to select terms. What are the criteria? Is this a good term? Is it a bad term? But we rarely learn to think about terminology as data, meaning we're not necessarily able to scale what we're able to do on our small scale to the scale that we actually need in big organizations like the European institutions or big companies. And that's why I think that it's more necessary than ever before to train highly specialized terminologists, and I think there is a real need. So maybe it will become more popular.
Thank you for this. This is such a positive note. I think we have a nice question in the Slido. Any of you, can you read them, or it's too far away? Right. So Natasha is asking, what would you advise to a translator to be the first steps into their terminology work and journey? How should they go about things? How should they start? I don't know if that's with the idea that they want to become terminologists, or it's about how to have good terminology resources for your translators' work. My take from what you, Simon, said just now, and also this question, is that somewhere in the background we are all the time saying like, we should have that ready, or somebody should do something for us, or it sounds so workflowy. It's like, what do we do first? Who should intervene first? What kind of things should be done first, and which should be done next? And is it just like, because if we imagine that the translator could work and could have a term base with ready answers, or a magic dictionary which would give him the answers, or they would have to stop every now and then, be interrupted to do the research. I think we all know, obviously, which is more rewarding and what would allow the translator to go more smoothly. But how to get there, how to set a good workflow, I think this is not only on the level of a company, this is also on how we organize our work. But let's look at the bigger picture, because we are at the DG Translation. That's a very big organization. We are also from other companies. And Simon, you have seen, I think, a lot of various setups. What would be the main golden rules to have before yourself, to set yourself, to make sure that you are doing the right way, the right things one after another?
Do you mean from a translator's perspective or from a terminology process perspective?
Isn't it like bound together?
I mean, they are, but it really depends. If I'm a translator and I do ad hoc terminology work for my translation projects, that's, let's say, my part. And I don't necessarily see the whole process I'm a part of. So that's why I'm asking. I mean, for a freelance translator, the advice I could give is to stick to the best practices we have concerning data quality and data management. So don't just throw everything in your terminology database. Define a metadata scheme that fits the projects that you're working on. I don't know, if you're a freelance translator, set up your term bases for individual clients, add metadata for content type or communication channel or subject matter or whatever it is that you're translating for this customer. So you can then maybe use adaptive machine translation by filtering out just the term entries that you need for a specific text. Let's say a press release for company A, or a technical data sheet for company B for a specific product family. And this is something that we do at a little scale as a translator, and that is done at a much larger scale, for example, by classifying and clustering data using metadata. That would be one very, let's say, hands-on tip maybe.
And if we had to marry the two, let's say that we have resources and terminology, we have translation, we need to deliver a translation which is of very high political importance, very urgently. What would be the workflow to manage that? Could you, Nina, share that? Your experience with, I'm now going to say it, they have recently been translating the NATO documents, NATO accession. That's really high political, very important stuff. And the time was really small. So how did you manage that? How did you, because I understand that you could not leave your translators just alone, and probably there were more than one working on the documents.
Mm-hmm, thank you. Yes, there were many translators working on the treaties and agreements and our legislation, also national legislation concerning NATO or accessing to NATO. Most of the texts were long and they had to be divided between translators. And of course, they contained lots of information about NATO that we never had translated before, and there were no terms for some specific NATO concepts in Finnish or Swedish before. And or if there were, they were varied in different texts. And so we also started a glossary project related to this, our journey into NATO, and it is a government-wide project where people from different ministries and the defense forces joined our terminologists and translators in this work, and we've been working glossary that contains the original NATO terms and definitions from NATO term database, and where there weren't any definitions, then we tried to find them somewhere else. And so we have terms that are defined. Not all organization names don't have definitions, but many others do. And so the English was the starting point here, the source language. And we had to decide what are the terms in Finnish and Swedish. And as I said, there weren't any in the first place because we hadn't thought about joining NATO until the security environment changed. So we had to very quickly start doing research on those terms and NATO's functions. But now we have a glossary containing 220 concepts, and we are still working for more. And hopefully it will serve many people and organizations in Finland. And the glossary is it's not about the operational or tactical terms. It's the terms needed in government or when we need to speak or write to the public. So it's on the more strategic or political level.
Thank you. That must have been a journey, and well, I'm a challenge-driven person, so I like when there is a little bit of stress and things happen. So this must have been a nice experience. We do have a question there to a terminology enthusiast. Was that to Simon or to Greg or to all of us? Who feels a terminology enthusiast?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think the moment I walked into my first terminology class, I was hooked. I mean, maybe it's also because of my background. I did linguistics rather than languages, and I think most translators go down the languages route. So I appreciated kind of, the theory and the rigor of terminology. And what you were saying, Barbara, about asking who's an enthusiastic terminologist, I think it's so important to have these enthusiastic people because they're the advocates for pushing terminology. And if you just have people that are, not that enthusiastic about it, no change is going to happen in your organization. So,
Another enthusiast?
I certainly am an enthusiast here, and I've always liked words and enjoyed researching in the terms. And I thought early on that may be my niche, and I want to go that way. And happily, I was first in a translation agency and had the chance to work on the term base, which was very elemental at that time. But I understand that not everybody is so keen on terminology work or researching and finding all the well, synonyms or near synonyms and finding what are the differences between them. But when I go and Google something and find, oh, this is interesting, what that's text, and what are they talking about there, and I'm just so happy doing this job.
I would also consider myself a terminology enthusiast, although I have to admit sometimes I'm a terminology hater, because of course I do love terminology work, but I'm also working as a translator, and sometimes I prepare the terminology up front so that I'm really prepared to delve into the translation assignment, but sometimes I really prefer to do ad hoc terminology work because it is some kind of distraction, and you don't have to focus too much time on doing all the preparatory work. And for those who do not like terminology so much, maybe you want to consider terminology as some kind of riddle that you have to solve. So finding a solution, for example, finding a synonym, as you have said, or finding an equivalent, and then you really use the enthusiasm and the satisfaction when you found the solution you were actually looking for.
Well, I think I became a terminology enthusiast twice in my career. At first, because I think as every terminologist, maybe I'm a bit weird. I love the nitty-gritty little details. I love compartmentalizing stuff and learning what it is and setting up everything properly. And I think that's what I first liked about terminology. And the second thing that made me really enthusiastic about terminology is to see how it fits in the digitization wave we see at the moment. I mean, when we look at our basic principles, let's say, okay, terminology is concept-based. Concept-based terminology is a great starting point for a lot of technologies that are really hot topics at the moment. Let's say knowledge graphs. If you look under the hood, you can work with the same principles for such technologies that we learn maybe in our terminology classes at university. So I think this is what made me really enthusiastic about terminology, to not only look at it as maybe language, but also as data that can be used in many different settings that are becoming more and more interesting to a lot of people who traditionally would have never thought about spending money on terminology. So that's my enthusiasm.
Thank you. And my enthusiasm is actually a little bit tordu. I mean, I'm not at all a detailed person. And like my understanding of terminology was, a dusty corner somewhere and people with dictionaries. That's not really my thing. But now that the technology is with 2 feet inside, it has really changed. So for me, I mean, being able to process a lot of text, like at the DGT, we've got loads of text coming in. So there is a mass of text. So I've got something coming in. I can process them in various ways. And then adventure, what can I do with the results? What do they tell me about? What other systems could I feed with that info? Can I get some analytics out of the fact that, for example, if I analyze text coming from one director general, so what is happening across the time with their text? Are they becoming longer? Are they smaller? What is happening? Is the terminology stable? Is that kind of thing is, for me, a very interesting game. Of course, it is not related to the close benefit that you have as translators, because this is more of a bigger picture. But this is something that is certainly part of the data management unit remit. So we're going to be busy with all these things and enjoy them. So I think there is a very interesting question about the place of experts in the workflow. Is it probably to Nina? When did you involve them, and when did they come in? or did you not? In the NATO project, did you ask them for opinion? Did they check the terminology, or they were so busy with other stuff that you had to deal yourself? What was your approach?
The experts were so busy because this was new to everybody, and so anybody who knew about NATO, they were wanted somewhere else, not in our project, but at first. But we managed to find people who could help us with expertise, and. Right from the start, so yes, it was necessary that we had people who knew about NATO. Did I answer the right question?
Well, I hope so.
I don't know which one was there on the screen.
Yeah, that was the green one.
Okay.
Okay. I saw a question on GPT. Do we use that in our work?
We do. So yeah, one thing that I've started using now that I was very skeptical of at first is using AI to support drafting definitions for concepts. So at least in DGT, the two kind of options we have are in Yate, there's like an embedded AI definition tool. And then there's a separate, I think it's still in testing, the e-drafting tool for definitions. And there you can really kind of target your input to give you a really convincing definition. With the tool in Yate, kind of AI just generates a definition, and you spend kind of more time trying to find where AI took that, and usually you can't find where AI took that because it's just a hallucination. But this other drafting tool that we have now, very skeptical of it first, but did a lot of testing in the past few weeks and was so impressed. Yeah, like in my normal terminology work, let's say I'm researching a concept and I'll find 5, 10 sources that talk about the concept. I'll paste the little bits that are useful to forming a definition into a Word document, and then trying to piece together what are the most common elements that define a concept. And it can really take quite a lot of time. And I found that, yeah, the drafting tool was very good at, yeah, if you just put in those very useful phrases that you've copied and pasted from sources that you've vetted and that you know that you trust, AI can really generate something nice, or even just be a starting point. I mean, in Yate, how we cite AI-generated definitions is we say the department that we're in, and it's based on. So at the end of the day, the human is always responsible for the end product. And I think in the last talk that we had, where they said translators were the custodians of public trust, the same is expected of terminologists, that we've looked into what AI has generated and made sure that it is correct.
I think what you just said, Greg, is probably the most important point, and also probably the most misunderstood point about generative AI, because people think that it's magic and it does everything on its own. And we heard earlier about the evaluation of e-translation, which is in itself a specialized resource. But even the specialized resources made terminology mistakes. And if you look at it from a broader perspective, it's even worse. People expect to ask maybe ChatGPT a question which is trained on anything, and they expect a really specific answer, which they will never get out of the system. It's statistically impossible. And this is also why, I mean, the promise that a lot of technology providers make is, yeah, use our technology, it will make everything easier and faster and cheaper. But the thing is, to get the most out of it, you have to put in a lot of work. The work shifts. Maybe your translators don't have as much work as they used to, or they're faster, or whatever. But if you really want to get the most out of it, you need a lot of other people. You need quality managers, you need language data specialists, you need MT specialists, whatever. And what you described is just the same. it makes a difference whether I ask ChatGPT, please draft a definition for term A, or if I ask it to do that and also provide a lot of reference material. And here we're back to data management. We have a big problem. Most of our data is in silos. Oh, there is our terminology silo. There's our document silo. I don't know, with our user manuals or whatever. Here's our translation memory silo. Yeah, that's becoming increasingly problematic because to get the most out of, say, generative AI, we have to create links between those silos. So the ideal world would be I go into my terminology management system, I click on generate draft for this term, it looks in my document repository, provides meaningful examples, and then drafts the definition based on that. Or I need to add translations. I click on add translation in all the 50 languages my company uses. And then in the background, it goes over my translation memories and filters out the segments that have the term I need and uses that to create the target language equivalents. But again, that's a lot of work you have to put in before you're even able to start dreaming about something like that. And I think that's the problem at the moment, because a lot of people expect the results, but they're not really clear on the work they need to put in. And that's where we come into play, I think, because we have these competencies, and I think they'll become more and more valuable. At least I hope so.
So since you mentioned data management and also the importance of terminological databases, so when we talk about large language models, we basically mean the commercial huge ones. But yesterday we have also heard that, for example, translators or terminologists might also train their own large language models according to a language combination or a certain terminology purpose. So they will be more suitable for the purpose or task at hand if they are trained for yourself. And on the other hand, I wanted to say, are you using GPT for your terminology work, as this was the question from the audience? So yes, I use it for very different purposes, as you said, for term extraction, for example, but also for definition generation, also for extracting context from already existing texts. But also very interesting, you can also go beyond the traditional language technology functionalities of large language models. So you might also use it for preparing or extracting relations between concepts. You can use image generative AI to also draft concept maps, which are very, very important for knowledge management, also for onboarding, for example, new employees in your organization. And large language models can also work as a co-terminologist. They can be your buddy or your consultant. For example, if you have drafted a definition yourself, you might ask, is this according to the following terminology principles? Is this a good definition? Or you can also brainstorm on other issues. And interestingly, studies show that many people use large language models also for psychological counseling. So if you experience a lot of pressure and frustration when working with other people as a terminologist, you might also consult large language models to help you cope with this mental load and psychological strains.
How do you do that?
I don't, but people do. But I use it really as a buddy or as a consultant, for example, in drafting definitions or also finding equivalents in the target language. So, but of course you have to consider, as we've heard before, that the quality of the prompt also determines the quality of the LLM output. And here a short anecdote from me being a teacher at the Center for Translation Studies and teaching terminology. So I also asked my students to use large language models and do different things with it. Extracting terminology, finding definitions, also making suggestions for a terminological database, so which data categories should be in the terminological database, to create TBX files with it, and so on. And what was very interesting is that large language models are only really useful if, on the one hand, you know the terminology of terminology. So you have to know what is term extraction, otherwise it won't work that well. You have to know what a TBX file is, you have to know what a target language equivalent is, so you really have to use the terminology of terminology in the prompt to achieve the best results. That's the first thing. And the other thing, you also need domain knowledge. For example, if you ask an LLM to output a definition for XY, you really need to know, you really need to have the knowledge to assess whether the definition could be correct. Because in the case when I used large language models with my students, the students had to write reflections on using the large language models, and the majority of them said, yeah, it provided correct definitions. But when I looked at the definitions from a terminology perspective, so they had to ask for definitions from terminology. For example, what's a synonym, or what's a term, or what's a concept? These definitions were not correct according to, for example, the ISO standards. So you also need the domain knowledge to assess whether a definition, a context, or whatever is really suitable. And the last thing is, of course, as we've heard before, the quality of the prompt determines the quality of the LLM output, meaning that you also need some LLM literacy or really experience in prompt engineering to make the most of LLMs in terminology work.
Thank you.
Well, and perhaps that's the link that's missing. I think a lot of skepticism towards AI is that there isn't this literacy yet. And yeah, I don't know how that could be fixed.
Well, the proof is in the eating. I think Dieter said earlier that he mentioned that there was an adoption problem in early days with e-translation, and yes, we waited this out because it showed it was good. So translators test, they see, and then they decide. They go for it because it's good, or they don't because it doesn't work out. So I think that this will come. Let's look at the questions. We're having a question here about term bases. Can they be more interactive and asking questions? That's very futuristic. I'm not sure about this. Would I like the term base to ask me questions? I don't know. Greg, would you like that kind of interactive life with your term base?
Yeah, I mean, that would have to completely change what a terminology base is. It could be interesting. I don't really know what to say, though.
I mean, you can talk to your term base, except not when it's a term base, but we talked about knowledge graphs earlier. You can talk to them. They have structured knowledge, and you can ask them questions about the knowledge they contain. So that would be one thing where you can actually talk to your structured knowledge, be it whatever form it takes. If that was the question. I wonder, Marco's online, so we can't ask him, I wonder if it isn't really a question about how can freelancers get answers to terminology questions, because that one pops up a lot. I don't know if he means that.
Yeah.
But
well, another interesting thing could be if you have a very intricate concept map, and then maybe asking, not just asking what's the equivalent of this, but finding some even more advanced way of expressing semantic relationships in terminology bases. Yeah.
Nina, there is a question for you.
Yes, whether we have used specific software to store our glossary data. We always have a terminology database where we store everything, whether it's a single term query we try to find an answer for, or a glossary. So we always put them in the terminology database, and then we take out exports and provide it outside because working in a public organization, it's so great that we can share everything we do, or everything, but everything that is worth sharing or is a good combination of terms, so a glossary or a list of terms. We can share them, and we can put them in our online government term bank called Walter. And also we have on our website many glossaries and guidance publicly available, and that's so great that we can share. And for our own translators, everything is accessible in the database.
And there is a question about having trust again in front of terminology entry. Should we be dubious or should we trust it? So, and who is responsible? So maybe a few words on how we work on IATA in DGT.
Yeah, where's the? Oh, it's in green. It's in green. I mean, we have many ways of showing reliability in IATA. And again, it's this thing of being, custodians of trust. When you see that in the definition references, you see that the actual department has worked on that part of the entry, then it really does show that we've had a look at it, and our working methods are really
Thank you. I would also say that there, you have to know what kind of resources you are tapping in. Yeah, so there are some resources like IATA that you know all, and they do have those reliability scores, and you probably very well know what is better, what is not. If you find some random stuff, then I mean, it's up to you to assess, looking inside, whether it looks good or not. However, I think that there is the other part of the question, responsibilities on terminologist or a translator. Well, it depends. I mean, if you know that the database is really created by terminologists, like it is the case in IATA, then you know about the workflow. You know where the terms come from. You know how the work starts, who chips in. Like in DGT, for example, we have our unit who is looking into incoming documents. We do, with tools, choose terms we decide which are the relevant ones. And then we involve Greg to check the English version, and only then, when we have a good definition, when we have metadata that we want to make sure that this is good enough, a terminology project is launched still inside. It is still our inner DGT life, where we invite other terminologists, because we have terminologists for each language, to add their equivalents. And they already know what the English term means, because Greg has done a good job. So definition is there, the metadata are there. Now they need to find out whether the term, the equivalent they found, is it the same stuff? Does it really correspond in their language? They add the definition, they add that. That's how we work. And this entry with the equivalents and with it gets a ranking, those little stars, the reliability. Yeah. So, and this points you to, this, I think it inspires confidence. How, in a way, is the process ensuring that certain steps have been done or ticked off, on your way. So you know that if it ends up there with a reliability at least 3, it means it's good enough.
Yeah, and I think our working methods have really changed in recent years, where we're really focusing on proactive terminology that's based on our documents, terminology that will be useful in the future, looking at entries that already exist and updating them, deleting massive amounts of noise from our database. And maybe the people that use Yate outside of the Commission don't know of these efforts behind there. But we really are making a concerted effort to really up the quality.
This question might also be related to the interactive terminological database. For example, there are terminology workflow tools where you do not only access the terms or the entries in the terminological database, but where you can also integrate, for example, domain experts or translators in the target language that can approve or provide feedback on the different terms or entries. And in addition, for example, I'm managing the University of Vienna's terminological database, where you can find from studies terminology to human resources and financial terminology related to the university ecosystem, where you can find all those terms. And then also the end users, which are the employees of the University of Vienna, can provide feedback on the entries themselves, meaning there is a feedback button where they can say, oh, the definition is wrong, or you made a typo, or the translation is missing. So there are also these feedback options that can be integrated in, or are already integrated in some terminology workflow systems. So the bridge to the interactive terminology database is already there.
I think the problem here from the perspective of that question is that terminology workflows and translation workflows are two completely separate things. And usually the terminology component we have in our actual translation workflow has nothing of all that. And that's probably the problem. There is no possibility in most scenarios out of my translation editor to say, oh, is this term right? Is this term wrong? Because mostly those systems are still apart. Translation systems have terminology components, but they're usually not really terminology management components out of the box. And the other question is, who would be at the other end? Is it my subject matter experts, and will they be getting a lot of questions from my translators? Probably not, because I want them to do other stuff. So I think it would be nice from a translator's perspective, but I think in many scenarios, it's not something that the actual clients would want, I think. They would maybe want them to forward the question to a project manager, but that's probably it. Maybe I'm too pessimistic.
Maybe not. Let's hope not. There is a fancy question here. Something about this detective thing. Cognitive pleasures of terminology work. I really like this formulation. Anybody who is ready to take that?
Well, of course, it depends on what cognitive pleasures you derive from terminology work. But I think some elements you can automate by means of large language models. You do not have to automate everything by means of large language models. So if you really enjoy certain terminology tasks, keep doing them manually or semi-automatically. And on the other hand, it also depends on how you really want to use large language models. On the one hand, in some cases, you need also creativity in terminology work, for example, coining new terms, and then you can consult with large language models to give you feedback on your newly coined terms, or you can use it as a Socratic opponent. For example, you have an idea and then the model challenges your idea, so you can come really to a better solution overall. So it really depends on what you want to do with large language models, what's the purpose of using them, and also what's the joy in terminology work that you do not want to lose.
So I'm not a terminologist, but I do get that pleasure of using AI aid tools. So I think there is something, I mean, it's still new, yes, and I think there is this excitement of something new, of discovering. So I'm not saying it should replace anything you like about terminology work, but I think you should start to look for a pleasure that you can get in a different way. That it can bring you so many other things that you wouldn't be able to reach out for, to do. Yeah. So yeah, as I said, I mean, for me, there are so many open doors now, and yeah, every day is a new day. So we come, although there is. How could I do it differently? Could I skip maybe that nasty bit or this kind of things? Well, I think it's an opportunity actually, and yeah. What do we have? We have plenty of questions, so I'm just looking for the ones that we are able to reply to. How would you inform, yeah, it's the third one, educate language service providers of the benefit of having terminology, providing them for translators? If I'm not mistaken, all major companies like Bosch and I don't know, even the big car companies in Germany, they have a very large databases, terminology databases, and they have been using them extensively, and recently I heard that they are doing an extensive cleaning of these databases. And I was thinking, like, why is that? Why is that? Was the content wrong, or did we find out that maybe we need to do it for certain reasons? Do you suppose what's the cause behind that?
A lot of people start cleaning their old data because now they realize they can do interesting stuff with it. We see that too. A lot of people, a lot of our clients want to clean their terminology, their translation memories. I think it's a trend because we have a lot of data-driven applications that are really cool at the moment. I think that's the reason.
Well, I would feel that it's because we would like to go further with the machines. And they can't make a decision whether it's this or that. Yep. So by reducing and making them one-to-one and making sure that if this is used, this is good, we can do that. But, well, this is much more tricky for EU and for IATE because it's such a huge database with so many domains that you cannot simply make it one-to-one. And okay.
Maybe to get back to the original question, and maybe we could also answer Alenka's question about how terminology work is compensated in this context. I mean, the problem is if we try to convince language service providers, or if translators try to convince language service providers that terminology is important, that's a problem because for the language service provider, if they're not paid for the terminology work, it's just cost without a direct financial benefit. And I think this has a lot to do with how terminology work, this is the other question, is compensated in the private sector, because usually what we still do is we pay our language service providers a lump sum, a word rate, and they have to do with it. There are other models. We see that some companies, they do terminology work, they charge it by the hour, which is, I think, the best way. Because, I mean, sometimes you can have one term and you spend 20 minutes on it, or you have a term and you spend 2 minutes on it. So there's really, I don't think that there's a really a good other way to measure that. There's also other, I mean, some people charge it by the entry. I've seen that as well. But I think at least for language service providers, in most cases, this is just, let's say, a side product. And when they're not explicitly paid for it, I think it's hard to convince them that it's actually necessary. But as you said, a lot of companies, they do their terminology work internally. And yeah, in that case, they give it to the TSP too. But
we are also sometimes buying or purchasing terminology services from outside translators or terminologists, and we have a competitive tendering process, and we have asked the tenders to give a price on an additional service related to terminology work. So they can do that if they want, and they have given us a price. And if we think that's worth paying, or the ministry thinks so, then we can purchase it, and it's a price per hour.
When coming back to the question, the benefit of terminology, I would even expand it to the question, the importance of terminologists, especially when we talk about the use of large language models for different language purposes, including translation and terminology work. Where terminologists are indispensable are areas, for example, where you have corporate language, because when we talk about these commercial large language models, they may contain some corporate language of your organization, but it's maybe just a small portion, so it might be hard to actually meet the corporate language, and terminology is of course part of a corporate language in your texts that you want to produce. So on the one hand you have this corporate language, this corporate terminology that you have to meet. On the other hand, if you have a very niche domain, it's also usually not covered very well in the training data, and that means that the LLM output would be kind of risky, so you need some healthy skepticism when evaluating, for example, definitions in these niche domains. On the other hand, large language models also produce a lot of hallucinations, especially in domains that are completely new, because they don't have the training data for this domain. So you need the terminologists, for example, to coin the new terms in this area. And the last thing is also within a language, you have different language varieties. For example, I come from Austria, so German is not only spoken in Germany, but also in Austria, Switzerland, also in Belgium, for example. And many terminologies are system bound, meaning, for example, the legal language, the educational language, and there are, of course, a lot of regional differences, a lot of language variety differences that only terminologists might be able to differentiate. Because, again, in the training data, you usually have the language data of the majority of the speakers, which in our case is German, so to say. So it might be difficult to also extract, for example, some Austrian terms, for example, in the legal area.
Thank you. Anybody from the audience who dares to ask a question? Come on.
Again? Sorry. As an LSP in regards to quoting terminology work, you're still quoting words, even if you quote it by the hour, because your client has to compare. So you have 1,000 words terminology work, and you say one word is 2 minutes, and you put it on the hour. It's all the same. So you're still quoting by words in terminology. So it's, you will still have that problem. But I think the best way to convince them is to tell them how many errors they can catch before, because errors cost your LSP the most money and your client too. Yeah.
We actually do have a few clients who really charge it by the hour, so they don't know in advance how much it's going to cost. But I know that's an exception. That's for sure. And yeah, about errors, that's probably a good argument. And I think, the best argument for an LSP would be if you tell them they can sell it as a value-added service, but in that case, they have to be able to sell it. So we're back to square one.
One of the questions there was someone with quite a few years of experience saying she starts with terminology extraction independently of the length of the text. And I just wanted to ask, what are the top tips to quickly extract terminology from a short text? That may still be very important for the UX, perhaps, of like whatever is a product.
Why would you worry about a short one?
Well, how do you do it at scale? Let's say you have to translate quite a few strings that make up the navigation of a mobile application. each of these is quite short, and you can't afford to spend a long time on each string. However, assuming that you want to sort of extract terminology, or whatever the equivalent on a short string is, I just wanted to know, what does that process look like? What's your tips?
What we do usually in DGT, we do have a tool, AI-based. So it's very user-friendly and fast, although it's still in the prototype mode. So we plan actually to push through most of the important documents so that we do get extractions from all the documents that are incoming. And until now, we haven't been doing it like for everything, but for a selection of documents, and it is very, very fast. So rather the issue is like we have to work on refining the output, because we do get the output, but it's not what we would like to have in the end. So we still need to work, like with this story of AI assisted definition drafting. So you do get it, and either you have to go back and find, invest your time to find where it comes from, how can I make sure that it's true, or that IP rights are not broken, and so on and so forth, or the other way around. I feed the system with my ideas, and I get help in putting them together. Yeah. So for the moment, I think there is no golden solution, but we do have in DGT, we're very lucky to have Termite One. I don't know if you have listened to that yesterday. It was an online presentation. It's recorded, so if you missed it, you can certainly listen to that. But it is internal. But it is, let's say, not to cry that you don't have it, because it's an idea of doing things. You might come up with something else. But I think that this is a certainly good starting point to have the terminology extraction. But yeah, in data management unit, we want to look also on other things, that on exploiting the results of the extraction, but possibly in a more analytical way. And as I said at the beginning, looking at the big picture and not only focusing on the terms themselves. And I think that that's a second thing that you can get out of it, and it's very promising. Anybody else? I think last question, 1 minute. Yes. You have to press the mic.
Hello. Just going back to Lucia Beale's comment on the fact that some terms in EU legislation, which were very kind of generic, weren't really picked up well by AI. Do you think there might be an influence where those terms will be used less in the future if AI becomes more popular in translation?
I wouldn't see the danger. Well, it depends. If they're already in the database, we are lucky to have an enormous database. So currently the situation, like in DGT, is that we are looking for new terms for very specific stuff that is upcoming, related to, for example, new policies. So what I think Professor Biel was talking about is this generic Eurolect thing. But that's really a different story. And I would say, from my point of view, it still remains with the skill of translators and of understanding the message that is behind what do we convey, what was meant by that or this expression. I think that terminology is really coming through as a more, let's say, technical, linguistic, but more precise support in the cases of new domains, of new legislation and so on. So I wouldn't worry unless we start legislating with AI, and then I don't know what happens, but I think we're very far away from that. So thank you. I think we'll stop here because we're out of time. Thank you everybody for being so attentive and not asleep, because I see you are listening and reacting. Thank you to all the... Thank you. I'd like to thank also the online participants and, of course, our guests. Thank you so much.
And thank you, Maria. Thank you very much, and the panel. So,
conference break. See you back at